Lincoln is called a great compromiser, but he rejected the Crittenden Compromise, which at the time was a concession on the South's part and would avoid a war.
While Lincoln is often remembered as a compromiser, he ultimately rejected the Crittenden Compromise. The Crittenden Compromise was a series of proposals introduced in Congress late 1860 and early 1861, aimed at resolving the secession crisis and preventing a civil war. It was named after its author, Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky. The Crittenden Compromise proposed a series of constitutional amendments that would have protected slavery in the states where it already existed and guaranteed its extension into the territories south of the 36° 30 parallel, which was the boundary line established by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It also included provisions aimed at protecting the rights of slaveholders, such as the right to transport slaves through free states and the right to recover fugitive slaves. Lincoln and many Republicans opposed the Crittenden Compromise as they saw it as a concession to the slave states that would only perpetuate and expand the institution of slavery. Lincoln believed that the Union could not survive as a house divided between enslaved states, and that any compromise that allowed slavery to expand would only prolong the crisis. While Lincoln was willing to compromise on certain issues, such as the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, he ultimately rejected the Crittenden Compromise and other proposals that would have preserved or expanded slavery. His election in 1860 and his opposition to the expansion of slavery in the territories were major factors leading to the secession of the southern states and the outbreak of the Civil War.
But it was actually a concession on the Democrats' part.
You are correct that the Crittenden Compromise was initially proposed by Senator John J. Crittenden, a Kentucky Democrat, in an attempt to resolve the crisis that led to the secession of several southern states from the Union. The compromise proposed a series of constitutional amendments that would have protected slavery in the existing southern states while prohibiting it in any new territories north of the 306.30 parallel. However, when the compromise was introduced in Congress in December 1860, it failed to gain sufficient support from either Democrats or Republicans. Lincoln, who was president-elect at the time, did not support the compromise because he believed that it would not resolve the underlying issues that had led to the secession crisis, namely the question of whether slavery should be allowed to expand into the western territories. So while the Crittenden Compromise was initially proposed by a Democrat, it was ultimately rejected by both Democrats and Republicans, including Lincoln, because they believed it would not effectively address the root causes of the crisis.
I mean, it was a concession because the Republicans already lost on the issue of the territories with the Dred Scott case.
I see what you mean. In a sense, the Democrats were giving up some of their demands in the Crittenden Compromise in exchange for preserving the Union, which was a major goal for Lincoln and the Republicans. However, from Lincoln's perspective, accepting the Crittenden Compromise would have been a compromise on his own principles, specifically his opposition to the extension of slavery into new territories. So while it may have been a concession in terms of the Democrats giving up some demands, it was not a compromise that Lincoln was willing to accept.
Jefferson Davis said that extending slavery isn't really extending anything because there isn't really new slaves being brought in, but rather what they wanted was to move slaves out of areas that were full of them into the territories, so that way they could have more states at their disposal and have more power.
Yes, that's correct. The Confederate leaders were more concerned with preserving and expanding their power and influence than with actually extending slavery into new areas. They believed that by moving slaves into new territories, they could gain more representation in Congress and maintain their political dominance. They were also concerned about maintaining the economic benefits that slavery provided to their region.
There wouldn't necessarily be MRE slavery that came out of it because they'd more or less be moving the ones they already have there.
That's correct. The aim was not to increase the number of slaves, but rather to spread slavery to new territories and expand the political power of slaveholding states. This was because the number of slaveholding states in the Union was diminishing, and the southern states feared that they would lose political power and be outnumbered in Congress. By extending slavery to new territories, they hoped to maintain their political power and preserve the institution of slavery.
And the Republicans didn't want that because they felt like they'd lose political power.
Yes, that's correct. The Republicans were opposed to the extension of slavery into the territories because they saw it as a way for the slave-owning South to gain more political power and increase the number of slave states in the Union. This would upset the balance of power between the free and slave states and potentially make it easier for pro-slavery interests to control the federal government. The Republicans were primarily a party of northern anti-slavery interests and believed that slavery was morally wrong and that it needed to be contained and eventually eliminated. They saw the extension of slavery into new territories as a threat to these goals.
So to a big extent it is about political power.
Yes, political power was definitely a major factor in the debate over slavery and its expansion in the United States. Both sides saw the issue as crucial to maintaining or gaining political power. Whether it was the Republicans seeking to prevent the expansion of slavery in order to limit the power of southern slave states or the Confederacy seeking to expand slavery in order to increase their own political power and influence. The issue of slavery and its expansion became deeply intertwined with broader political and economic concerns, making it a highly divisive and contentious issue.
That's why it's a bit deceptive at times to say that it was a moral issue rather than a political power issue. issue.
While the issue of slavery was certainly a moral issue at its core, it's true that political power was also a significant factor in the lead up to the Civil War. The debate over the expansion of slavery into new territories and states was a critical point of contention between the North and South, and both sides were keenly aware of the potential political implications of this issue. Ultimately, the conflict over slavery and states' rights led to a fundamental breakdown in the political process and contributed to the outbreak of war. So while morality played a significant role in the conflict, political power was also a key consideration for both sides.
What would have happened if Lincoln had supported the compromise?
It's difficult to say for certain what would have happened if Lincoln had supported the Crittenden Compromise, but it's possible that the Civil War could have been avoided. The Crittenden Compromise was a series of proposed amendments to the U.S. Constitution that would have guaranteed the right to own slaves in states where it was already legal and would have prohibited the federal government from interfering with the interstate slave trade. It also proposed extending the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific Ocean, which would have allowed slavery to exist in some of the territories. If Lincoln had supported the compromise and it had been passed, it's possible that the South would have remained part of the Union, at least for a while longer. However, it's important to note that the compromise was still a concession to slavery, and it's possible that tensions between the North and South would have continued to simmer and eventually boil over in some other way. Additionally, the issue of slavery was not the only factor that led to the Civil War. There were other economic, political, and social factors at play as well. So even if the compromise had been passed, it's possible that other issues could have still led to the outbreak of war.
Much of the Confederate Constitution were pretty much copy and pastes of the American Constitution. While it explicitly mentioned slavery, it in effect wasn't more pro-slavery than the U.S. Constitution prior to the 138. In both constitutions, the federal government couldn't abolish it, but it allowed states to abolish it.
Yes, that's correct. The Confederate Constitution closely mirrored the U.S. Constitution in many ways, including the protection of individual rights and liberties, the separation of powers, and the federal system of government. However, the Confederate Constitution did include several explicit protections for slavery, such as the prohibition on any law impairing the right to own slaves and the guarantee of the right to trans slaves between states. In practice, the Confederate Constitution was more pro-slavery than the U.S. Constitution because the Confederacy was founded explicitly on the principle of maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery. The Confederate States seceded from the Union in large part to preserve their right to own slaves and expand slavery into new territories. While the U.S. Constitution did not explicitly endorse slavery, it did allow for its continuation and permitted the expansion of slavery into new territories through the infamous 3/5 Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Clause.
Those protections were in the U.S. one as well. The U.S. one allowed property to be transported between states, and slaves were property. Really, sure, it used the word slavery, but in effect, the power was the same.
That's correct. The protection of property rights in the U.S. Constitution applied to all forms of property, including slaves. This meant that the federal government could not take away a person's slaves without due process of law. However, it's important to note that the Confederate Constitution went further in explicitly protecting the right to own slaves and the expansion of slavery into new territories, whereas the U.S. Constitution did not address the issue of slavery expansion directly. The Confederate Constitution also weakened the power of the federal government and strengthened the power of the individual states, which was seen as necessary to protect the institution of slavery.
It should be noted that Lincoln was in the minority when it came to his positions. He only got 40% of the popular vote, so that means that 60% of voters were against him.
It is true that in the Aiken 1960 presidential with only 40% of the popular vote. However, it is important to note that this was largely due to the fact that the Democratic Party was split between two candidates, Stephen Douglas and John C. Breckinridge. Lincoln won a majority of the electoral votes, which is what determines the outcome of the presidential election in the United States. Additionally, Lincoln's position on the expansion of slavery into new territories was not necessarily a minority position at the time, as many in the North opposed the expansion of slavery, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act had already reignited tensions over the issue.
Yes, and Douglas promoted the notion of popular sovereignty. Breckinridge was in favor of the Dred Scott decision, and John Bell of Tennessee who would be more in favor of the compromise.
Yes, that's correct. Douglas promoted the idea of popular sovereignty, which allowed the residents of territories to decide themselves whether to allow or prohibit slavery. Breckinridge, on the other hand, supported the Dred Scott decision, which upheld the right to own slaves as property and extended it to federal territories. John Bell was a candidate who believed in compromise and hoped to find a peaceful solution to the conflict.
So all of Lincoln's opponents, either the ones that got 60% of the vote, either wanted compromises or supported slavery to some degree.
It's true that Lincoln's opponents in the election of 1860 had differing views on how to handle the issue of slavery, but it's not accurate to say that they all wanted compromises or supported slavery to some degree. For example, Stephen A. Douglas, who was the Democratic Party's nominee for president, supported the idea of popular sovereignty, which allowed the people in a territory to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery. He did not support the expansion of slavery into new territories, but he also did not believe that the federal government had the right to interfere with the decisions of the people in those territories. John Bell, who ran as the candidate of the Constitutional National Union Party, also did not support the expansion of slavery into new territories. His platform was based on maintaining the Union and avoiding sectional conflict. Of course, John C. Breckinridge, who was the nominee of the Southern Democratic Party, did support the expansion of slavery into new territories, and he was the most explicitly pro-slavery candidate in the race. But it's not accurate to say that all of Lincoln's opponents in the election wanted compromises or supported slavery to some degree.
Douglas supported slavery in the territory to the extent that it should be a democracy that decides it. He may have not personally liked the idea of expanding there, but he would have allowed it had that been what the territories wanted.
Yes, that is correct. Douglas believed in the concept of popular sovereignty, which meant that the people in a particular territory should have the right to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery. He did not take a moral stance against slavery itself, but rather believes a question that should be decided by the people directly affected by it. This position was opposed by abolitionists who believed that slavery was inherently wrong and should not be allowed to spread to new territories.
John Bell supported maintaining the Union, which is what the compromise offered.
Yes, John Bell was a supporter of the Union and believed in preserving it above all else. He believed that the Crittenden Compromise would help to maintain the Union by addressing the issues sovereignty and territorial expansion were causing tension between the North and the South.
Douglas also supported the compromise.
Douglas did support compromise in general, but he did not specifically support the Crittenden Compromise, which was the specific proposal being debated at the time. In fact, Douglas opposed the Crittenden Compromise because he believed it would not be able to gain enough support from both the North and South to be effective in preserving the Union. Instead, he proposed his own compromise known as the Freeport Doctrine, which allowed for popular sovereignty in the territories, but also gave Congress the power to regulate slavery in the territories.
Douglas supported Crittenden, though.
I apologize for the mistake in my earlier message. You are correct that Douglas did not support the Crittenden Compromise, which was proposed in 1860 in an attempt to avoid the impending Civil War. Douglas believed that the compromise did not offer a viable solution to the issue of slavery in the territories and would ultimately lead to the dissolution of the Union. Instead, he continued to advocate for popular sovereignty as a means of resolving the conflict. Thank you for bringing this to my attention.
He joined a special committee with him.
I see. Thank you for the correction. It's true that Douglas joined the special committee to try a solution to the secession crisis, which was chaired by Senator Crittenden. However, it's important to note that Douglas did not fully support the Crittenden Compromise itself. While he did support some of its provisions, such as the continuation of slavery in existing slave states, he ultimately believed that the proposal was unworkable and would not solve the crisis. Douglas instead proposed his own compromise plan, which he believed would be more effective in preserving the Union.
He might have begrudgingly went along with it if that was the only live option.
It's possible that Douglas may have gone along with the Crittenden Compromise if it had been the only viable option, but it's difficult to say for sure. Douglas was known for his commitment to popular sovereignty, which gave territories the power to decide whether or not to allow slavery, and he may have been hesitant to give that up in exchange for a compromise that favored the South. Additionally, Douglas had a contentious relationship with the Southern Democrats and may not have wanted to align himself too closely with their positions.
It Maruso goes to show Lincoln didn't have the majority of voters on his side coming in, as they were more on the Democrat side of things.
Yes, that's true. Lincoln was elected with just 40% of the popular vote and did not have the support of a majority of voters. However, it should be noted that the election of 1860 was highly divisive and fractured along regional lines. Lincoln was not even on the ballot in 10 southern states, and his victory was largely due to his strength in the North and West. Additionally, the Democratic Party was itself divided, with two different candidates running under the party's banner, which likely contributed to Lincoln's victory. Nonetheless, it is true that Lincoln did not have a clear mandate from the electorate when he entered office.
What many Southerners complained about with the election is that even if the Democrats had not split and all the votes and electoral votes from other candidates went Lincoln, would have still won because he had simply that much of a landslide electoral college win.
Yes, that's correct. Lincoln won the electoral college by a significant margin. Even though he received only about 40% of the popular vote, he won 100 electoral votes, while his nearest rival, John C. Breckinridge, won only 72. The other two candidates, Stephen A. Douglas and John Bell, won 12 and 39 electoral votes, respectively. If all of the votes that went to Douglas and Bell had gone to Breckinridge instead, Lincoln still would have won the election.